Hello there, my name is Gavin Walsh and this is podcast number 6 as part of the St. Kevin The Truth Files. Today is a very special day because it's actually the 74th anniversary of the tragedy of the St. Kevin, Ireland's first and Aer Lingus' first ever fatal air disaster. It happened on the 10th of January 1952, which was a Thursday, and of course today is the 10th of January 2026. So we're almost up on the 3/4 of a century mark. I want to talk to you today about a very unique case that is extraordinarily unique to the St. Kevin in terms of survivability, for want of a better word. There were 25 children left without a parent when the St. Kevin crashed. Out of those parents that killed, one of them had actually adopted 3 children. So you in their young teenage years, you could augment that up to 28. And then there were an additional 3 posthumous born St. Kevin babies. That is, mothers whose husbands were killed in the crash and who were pregnant at the time of the crash. And those 3 kids came along after. So that's about 31. That is exactly 31. Now, believe it or not, there was a 32nd, which I never knew about. And I found out by complete, I suppose, a couple of strokes of luck. And only for this story, this would never have come to light. There was actually somebody who never boarded the St. Kevin, who didn't, out of the other 31, if you all say they lost a parent, there was actually a boy who didn't board the St. Kevin who lost both parents. And if you look at the definition of the word orphan, this is the true St. Kevin orphan. And in fact, I have an inset or a chapter in volume 3 that I will be done called the St. Kevin orphan, the sole St. Kevin orphan, St. Kevin orphan. And to understand who he was, we have to go back to the time of World War II. There was a young man from Midhurst in South England, and his name was Richard Laker. He was known as Nicky Laker, and he joined the RAF at a very young age. I believe he was about 17 or 18, and he was flying Spitfires in no time. And indeed, at a very young age as well, probably 19, he was flying the Spitfires over his parents' home, or over his mother. Excuse me, his mother had died giving birth to him. So he was flying Spitfires out of his local airbase 10 miles down the road. And he would often, his boss would let him whiz up over, I guess, to induce some kind of camaraderie amongst the locals, because the school in Midhurst had been bombed and children had been killed. So he would get in the Spitfire and do a daring run over the houses and do all sorts of things before he'd go back to base. And people would say, oh, there's the young Laker boy. But Nicky Laker, as part of his training, was sent to Canada, which was the pretty norm. In fact, all 3 St. Kevin, the other 2 St. Kevin pilots, Alec Newman, the first officer, and Captain Keohane, they were all sent overseas. Rhodesia, and Laker was sent to Canada. Nicky Laker ended up in training with the Canadian Air Force on the DC-3s in Canada. And out there he met a lady who he fell in love with, a lady called Dorothy Eyring Martin, her surname being Martin. And they fell in love and they got married. And in no time, of course, Nicky, as Richard Laker was known, Nicky got his wings and was brought back to the theatre, the battle theatre of Europe. And Nicky was an extraordinarily accomplished pilot, having flown at least 5 different types of fighter and bomber aircraft, including US heavy bombers. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Nicky Laker was the most, in terms of aircraft type, I would say that Nicky Laker was the most prolific pilot in Aer Lingus at the time of his demise. Now, I should also have pointed out that Nicky Laker was not in the flight crew on the St. Kevin aircraft, but I am absolutely certain he was on the flight deck at the time of the crash, the time of the terrible tragedy. And I have plenty of anecdotal or circumstantial evidence to back that up, how he and First Officer Newman's bodies were found together, and there was a radio telephony booth found nearby. I have no evidence that Captain Nicky Laker was a member of Tejas Disciples, but I have a bountiful of evidence that he was against flying this dangerous direct route. He confided in his family, and all of this came to pass in days after the crash. Okay. So as I've said, the crash happened on Thursday, the 10th of January. So the following Monday, 4 days later, the inquests were held in Caernarvon, which is a town in North Wales, in a coroner's court. And an inquest is to determine the cause of death. But Nicky Laker had a brother called Victor Laker, who was a really, really smart guy. This guy could think outside the box. He was also a chartered accountant. And Victor Laker turned up at the inquest and he started asking very, very serious questions. In other words, he elected his right to go into the witness box to question the coroner. And one of his first questions to the coroner was, are you aware that Aer Lingus have been carrying out a gross unsafe flying practice by flying over the mountains all around us here? And the coroner didn't know how to answer that, because a coroner is a medical man. And Victor Laker, Nicky's brother, knew he wasn't going to get satisfactory answers, but he wanted it put on the record. And he bombarded them with one question after the other, knowing these would go into public record. Suffice to say that the inquests were postponed. And 2 weeks later, when the second round of inquests took place, Victor Laker was not asked along. And the system in place knew that Victor Laker was going to become a very serious thorn in their side. And about a month after the inquest took place, the British police, in conjunction with the Welsh police, pulled off what I would describe as a dirty tricks campaign to silence Victor Laker, if not to silence him, to frighten the hell out of him. It didn't work to the best of my knowledge, but what I do know is that Victor Laker's fight was in vain. Now, Victor Laker had as much knowledge as I have had to acquire, but Victor Laker was missing one thing: witness statements. So Victor Laker did not know the true final flight path of the aircraft, but he did hazard a guess, that it was going around in circles. And this was something that he brought up at the first inquest. Now, Victor Laker was non gratis at the second inquest, and he was absolutely, unequivocally not allowed to attend the inquiry. He could attend it in the public gallery, but he was not one of the invited witnesses, even though he tried to get on board. Unfortunately, Victor Laker gave it his everything, and I'd like to say, Victor Laker, if you're up there, you've been of great help to me, and we'll carry the mantle for you till we get justice for your brother, Richard Laker, Nicky Laker. Victor Laker gave it all he had throughout that whole summer, and he wrote letters to the Martins, which was his in-laws, which is the Canadian lady who met his brother when his brother was learning to fly out there. And he wrote repeated letters from them. Now, when I was able to track the Martin family down, which was very, very difficult because they came from a tiny little town called Cochrane, hundreds of miles north of Toronto, in the middle of nowhere, effectively, Cochrane, Ontario. The Martins, they had all since dispersed and moved on. But as it turned out, Nicky Laker had got Dorothy pregnant when he was called back to England to fight in the war. And Dorothy had a boy called Terry Laker. So evidently Terry Laker is the sole St. Kevin orphan. Now, I'm making this video for two reasons. Reason number one, obviously, is the anniversary, and it is time for podcast number 6. Reason number two is that Terry Laker died last week on the 31st of December 2025. He just narrowly missed seeing in the new year. Terry had a very troubled life himself, and this had a detrimental effect on his entire life. I met him, in fact. I met all his family. But Terry himself was, when Nicky got called back to England, his wife Dorothy, obviously, a few months later, gave birth to their son, the Terry. And after she gave birth, the last thing she wanted to do was to lose her husband. Her husband could not get back over because of the war years. So she entrusted the care of Terry to her parents, Terry's grandparents, Terry's maternal grandparents. And she came across to England and sailing into Liverpool. And she met she re-met Nicky, her husband. And as the war came to an end, Nicky applied for jobs, and everyone in the RAF was applying either to get into BEA, which is British European Airways, BOAC, British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, or Aer Lingus. And bear in mind, the two former that I just mentioned, BEA and BOAC, they own 40% of Aer Lingus. Now, Nicky Laker was successfully given a job in Aer Lingus, and he came straight in as a first officer, but he rapidly became a captain and a senior captain. So they moved to Dublin, and what we have is a huge chain of letters sent from the Lakers to their little boy Terry, and telling them how Daddy has got a big airline job with an Irish airline called Aer Lingus, and as soon as they save up the money, they're gonna be reunited. Now, in the meantime, what's happened is Terry's grandparents, who are now raising him in this small town called Cochrane, they of course have become extremely attached to the child. And at one point, the parents request that they ship Terry over to them, and the grandparents. And the grandparents resolutely refused that on the grounds of, safety and everything else. And they didn't want to, but the reality was the grandparents didn't want to let go of him. Now, they would obviously acquiesce if Nicky and Dorothy would turn up in Canada and collect the child. But that was out of the question, because in the meantime, when they moved to Dublin, Dorothy had got pregnant with their second child, Sharon Melody Laker, who was known as Melody. And Melody was a beautiful little child, and in any event, all three of them would perish on the St. Kevin. Being a senior captain, Nicky Laker put in for holiday leave immediately after Christmas, and this is where a whole sequence of a confluence of, I guess, bad circumstances culminate to ensure that they will all perish. Nicky Laker flies over with his family, arrives into Northolt Airport, which was London's main airport, on Christmas Eve. He is now on holidays, having worked right up to that, and he's on a 2-week vacation. And he's going to spend that time in Midhurst, or the little village outside of Midhurst, with his father and his father's two sisters who had raised him, his two aunts. And as he arrives into Northolt Airport, the first sequence of things that are going to go wrong starts. This is 2 weeks before he will die on the St. Kevin. An Aer Lingus manager approaches him and tells him that whether it's, and I don't know what the reason for this ever was, but it's an absolute fact that happened, whether it was to do with staff rotation or a staff member or a pilot becoming unwell or whatever it was. It took 2 pilots to legally fly the DC-3. They needed another pilot to bring the last flight back that evening, or passengers will be stranded and not get home for Christmas. So Nicky Laker did a deal with the manager there and then on the spot, and the deal he did was, I will fly these passengers back with whoever the co-pilot was, and but subject to the following conditions. I have to get back here tomorrow to have Christmas dinner with my family. And the Aer Lingus manager at the airport basically said, look, name your terms. And Nicky's terms were quite simple. He said, A, you got to fly me back tomorrow morning, or Nicky could fly himself back, but it would take 2 more pilots to bring the plane back to have it in Dublin, ready for business as usual on Stephen's or Boxing Day morning, as the British called it. And I also want a taxi to bring me down to my dad's house in Midhurst. I'm not going on trains. Well, there probably were no trains Christmas Day back in 1951, so... the manager at Northolt, the Aer Lingus manager at Northolt Airport readily acquiesces. So, and of course, Nicky's wife and daughter had to be put in a taxi there and then. So it all went to plan. And Dublin Airport had to specifically open on Christmas morning of 1951. So Nicky Laker could be flown back to Northolt. I'm sure Northolt was open on Christmas Day. It was the busiest airport in Europe at the time. And Nicky came back in a DC-3 with 2 pilots, obviously, because it would take the same 2 to bring it back empty to have it ready for business as usual revenue passengers on Boxing Day morning. And the taxi was arranged in Nicky. So Nicky made his Christmas Day dinner down in Midhurst on Christmas Day. 2 weeks later, Nicky's father, it was time to come home. They had spent the entire Christmas with Nicky's father. And indeed, they had sent a lovely picture of Nicky, his wife, and the beautiful little baby Melody. And Melody is standing with her little tricycle, and she's got her little doll. I believe I'll put up the photograph here. I believe the doll is she's dangling it behind her, but you'll see the tricycle. And these were Christmas gifts. Now they actually mailed this photograph in a letter to her baby brother, to Melody's baby brother Terry in Canada, and of course it arrived after they were all killed. But the morning that they were going for the train, and the train line the train line came down from, it was the train, I believe, down to Southampton, and then there was a branch off to Midhurst. But from Midhurst there was another localised branch, a little small, like 2-carriage train that serviced 3 or 4 stops. And that line was a zigzaggy line, so basically if you were travelling by road you could pass it faster. But on the morning of on the fateful morning of January 10th, whatever happened, they were a few minutes late going out the door, and Nicky's father was driving Nicky, Nicky's wife, Dorothy, known as Dolly, and she was also known as Penny, by the way, in England, and little Melody, and they were going back to Ireland, Thursday, January 10th, 1952. And as they turned up at the first station, they saw the train leaving it, so they pushed on to the second station, and they still didn't catch it. But this time they did the shortcut I was telling you about, where they went straight, and they caught the Peterborough train. Now, even though they still made the train to London, what happened was the fast train that would have taken them straight to London, they missed that because of this misconnections along the way, and they got a slow train at Peterborough. This had a domino effect in that instead of getting out early afternoon on the pre-165, which I gather was the 159, 161, or maybe the 163, the secretive flight that they don't talk about. Nicky Laker and his wife and kid ended up on the early evening flight, the flight of EI 165, our fateful flight. Now, when Nicky got into Northolt, bear in mind Nicky's job brought him in and out of Northolt all the time, so he was on first name terms with everyone. It was a very friendly BEA ground hostess. Aer Lingus didn't have ground hostesses in Northolt. They had mechanics, they had a manager, but they did not have ground hostesses. The traffic just didn't warrant it. And by the way, the reason the mechanics Aer Lingus were so safety conscious, they didn't trust outsourcing mechanics to anyone except their own crews. So they had actually 4 charge hand mechanics at Northolt, believe it or not. But Northolt was their busiest route, and they had a manager with no ground hostess. But the ground hostess was the BEA, Mrs. Patricia Roberts, known as Bunny. And of course, when Nicky went to the counter, Bunny said, Mickey, what flight do you want? Now, this would depend on availability. These guys are flying standby. And Nicky literally said to her, who are the captains going on? And she read them, and once she read the name Jimmy Keohane, Nicky just said, put me on Jimmy's flight, and the rest is history. Nicky Laker and his wife and child died. It's just also tragic, a whole bad sequence of bad luck. Now, immediately after the crash, Nicky Laker's body was recovered. And he had a full-scale funeral and full honours down outside of Midhurst, where he is buried today. I believe it's Karen Lane Cemetery, and personally, in my opinion, it's the nicest cemetery on planet Earth. I've been to it, I think about 15 times. I'll post a photo up here of it. And indeed, only last year, Nicky got not a brand new headstone, which would be a sin. He got his existing headstone beautifully rejuvenated. It's absolutely beautiful. Now, one of the saddest parts of this for me when I did this story was Nicky's father. Nicky's father was a retired policeman, old-style policeman in a small British village. And Nicky's father didn't want to get caught up in the furore of meeting his son's coffin at Peterborough, where all the press were and everyone else was. So he put in a very unusual request that as the train left Peterborough and went on that last zigzag line that I've told you about already, that brought them close to their little village, which was just outside of Midhurst, he made a very unusual request that before the final stop and out of the view of everybody, if he could stand in a field and the train would come to a stop. And this was all prearranged, and this actually went off smoothly. And Nicky Laker's father stood in at an exact pre-appointed spot, and the train came to a halt. and the conductor opened the side door, the side carriage door, and there was Nicky Laker's coffin draped in a Union Jack, and rightfully so, because he was a war hero and an Englishman. And the father just stood there and cried. Just his eyes, tears just flowed down his face. Now, we know this because Nicky's nephew, who was a grandson of this man, the old man Laker, is Dave Simmons, and Dave Simmons is still alive today. And David Simmons related this to me in minute detail. Dave watched from afar. His grandfather was given the privacy to cry for his son, and he literally just said when he got home, "The old boy is home," meaning his son was home to be buried. Now, tears aside and everything else aside, Victor Laker was Nicky's brother, who smelled a rat right from the get-go. He smelled a rat from the night the crash happened. Can you believe that? Victor Laker was having none of this nonsense that was going on, or so he thought he was having none of it. Little did he know the huge players he was up against. But when Victor Laker started to run out of all options, he actually wrote several letters to his Martin in-laws in Cochrane, Ontario, Canada. And thankfully, a lot of those are all replicated in my story and my third volume. And in one of them, he told that there was virtually no hope of compensation because the onus would have to be put on the airline, that the accident was down to them. Now, believe it or not, the Laker family and Terry Laker, the young boy left orphaned, got zero, nothing whatsoever. Can you even comprehend that? But Victor Laker was not about to let it go that easy. When the inquiry started and he noticed that the media was completely either downplaying this or watering it or wording it in such a way that it was to prove non-attackative or it wouldn't go against non-disadvantagetive to the airline, Victor Laker did something extraordinary, unusual. He bought a flight, because he obviously flew with Aer Lingus. They were the only ones doing Dublin, London. He flew over of his own accord or his own shilling, and he requested a meeting. There was only 3 Irish newspapers in Ireland at the time, 3 broadsheets, the Independent, the Press, and the Times. And he went to each of the papers, and each time he was met by a journalist who told him, "That's not my department," whatever. But he went to the Irish Press, and a senior journalist came out, and Victor Laker said, "Why are you not covering this story?" And he got probably one of the most honest answers ever given on the face of planet Earth. And the senior journalist said to him, "You want an answer? Here it is. The advertiser list, the pressure is on us. The pressure's on from government. It's looking like it's going against the airline, and we have a business to run." And instead of Victor Laker being annoyed, he was a very logical-minded man. He thanked the guy. He thanked him for his honesty, that he was the first person that gave him an honest answer. And of course, we know all this because Victor Laker then went and put all this in writing to the Martins in Canada. Whatever of it all, let's come back to Nicky Laker's funeral. So Nicky Laker has a funeral, and he gets buried in the beautiful cemetery I've told you about. And something very unusual happened next. They kept that grave open for the guts of a month in the hope that Melody and her mother, Penny or Dolly, would be found. And it was supposed to be one of the saddest cases ever in a graveyard, and certainly in Midhurst, was when they gave up all hope a few weeks later and they had to bury that, fill in that hole. And so the upshot of all this is that Nicky Laker is buried in Midhurst, where all belonging to him have been buried. And Dorothy and her baby girl Melody are left in a plane in a mountaintop. I mean, can you believe that? And they're in that plane, in that filthy bog-hole, on top of a mountain, 74 years today. It's just one of the more tragic aspects of the St. Kevin story. And I'm glad I could bring it to you today. Okay.